So I'm going to talk about a LeSS adoption I did a few years ago at a Ukrainian company called Poster. So this is not a talk on theory. I'm not going to tell you how you do LeSS adoption. I will just share my learnings, looking back at that, the things I would have done differently. And there are a lot of things actually I would have done differently. And I'm sure all of you can learn a little bit of that. It's also the talk that has a case study on that. There's a menu now and an empty page, so it's a placeholder for this talk. It's already in review. It's 80 pages of detailed analysis, so I'm not gonna repeat that. Very soon, this case study will be announced publicly, but you are actually the first people who hear about that, so you should be proud of being here. And also look around. This is a fantastic room. Like this is a real booth where I guess audio engineers see it. It's is it? It's not vice versa. Yeah, dead run. Yeah. Okay. All right. So it's all handwork. Yeah. So after I finish, feel free to go and touch the walls. You're invited. Thank you for this interaction. Yeah. So about a poster. So poster has nothing to do with posters. A poster comes from POS, which is a point of sale. So it's a software as a service that is basically covering restaurant industry, or how they call it is Horeca, which is like the all about food and drinks and restaurants. And these guys are basically building not just like a menu website, but everything you as a restaurant owner might need to actually run your business, from inventories to cash desks, to sending information to the tax departments, to your experience as a restaurant guest, to an experience of a waiter. So like a really, really complex software. I think one of the most complex software hardware solutions I've seen in my life, and it's called a Poster. And like to give you more details how complex the domain is. So while we were doing this LeSS adoption, there were a bunch of changes on the Ukrainian tax market, where for every bottle a bartender opens, he needs to send an information to the tax department. So the tax department in Ukraine wants to know how many bottles get opened a day. So in real time, you need to send this data and then question. And I've been through PBR meetings where people were discussing this over and over again. How am I supposed to do it if I'm opening a bottle, but I make like 10 cocktails out of this bottle? How many times I send data to the tax department? 1 or 10 times. So a lot of domain complexity involved in this product. Okay. I was hesitant to speak last year about this talk. I was also hesitant to write a case study about it. And it's a message to some of you who already had case studies and not sure if they're going to write at some point about them. And I'm looking at some people who I know have case studies. If you think it's just boring, it's a plain vanilla LeSS adoption, what would people learn from it? Just write it. There will always be something unique, some learnings, and I'm just showing you an example that even it's a very simple adoption, essentially we just did that, but with 6 teams. Thank you for the talk. It was good to have you. Now we can go to the open space. So essentially, like, it was nothing really fancy about it. Essentially one backlog and 6 teams, and working like this up until now. 2 years later, I quit that company as an external guy. But anyways, I think there are some things we can discuss in this regard. Because it was a small company, the CEO took the job of the product owner. I was at a bus Vodis class last year. Actually, I'm trying to retake the classes every year just because so much information, also recommended for you. Buzz says the following, like CEO should not be the product owner, because then the developers are kind of reporting essentially to the product owner. So you won't have two parallel reporting lines. So developers see product owner as somebody equal. But in a small company like this one, and it's about 120 people company with 50, 60 developers, it typically happens that the CEO would be the first product owner to actually do this job and then later on hire a professional product manager. So the CEO of this company said the following: it's the first time in the company's history more than several teams can work together on what's really important for the business. You know, like this company was already 7, 8 years old when I joined them, and everybody was working on what they knew. The question is like if it's fast or slow, and we did a lot of webinars when we explain how we are working with LeSS, and developers will typically ask you like, what's about speed? Well, what about efficiency? And the CEO typically answers, I don't care about the local speed. Now, as a company, I have a tool to put as many teams as I want to work on really important, right? So from the global optimization point of view, well, that's the only thing that can make you stay in the business, is to put as many people as you want to work on something that is really, really important. And already in the 2 or 3 LeSS, in the second and third LeSS sprint, they've seen that effect, the 2 and 3 teams who are working together essentially on one big item on the backlog that they were splitting and working on. This is a picture of a year and a half later in the LeSS adoption. This is the office in Dnipro in Ukraine, and as you can see, there's no lights in this office because of the blackouts last winter because of the war. And despite of the COVID, and COVID hit really badly the restaurant industry, as you can imagine. Then the war hit really badly the restaurant HoReCa industry. This company had to stop serving all the Russian clients. So actually after 2 days the war started, they cut all the Russian accounts and show some war statement in the UI instead of what you would expect in a restaurant. But despite of that, this company is basically in the middle of the war, celebrating that they've just onboarded 100 new restaurants. So my take on that is that adaptivity provides the ability for the business to stay relevant for the customers and stakeholders for as long as it takes. So adaptability, and Craig Larman also says this as like this, adaptability is not a self-licking ice cone. So it serves a goal. And I think the goal I saw that adaptability served in this company is actually resilience. The company is super resilient. Nothing could really hit this company, and actually COVID and war, like the worst thing you can have basically in the country, and the company is actually doing great and is profitable and is fantastic. So just some ideas on the business of the company. Side note, if you're not making notes about your LeSS adoption and about your client work, I recommend you start doing this tomorrow. So just every day have a habit to make screenshots of the calls you were in and type few things. A year later, it will be very much interesting and insightful for you to go through this list. So I'm using Notion for that, and I'm not advertising this tool, but I think Notion is a great tool where you can actually have a rich text information. Interestingly also, this company was using Notion for backlog management. Anybody is familiar with Notion? Essentially, it's a notes-making app, but also with the list, with the databases. It's like a Google spreadsheet, but way better. So actually, they essentially used Notion to manage the company backlog, which is, I think, a very interesting and fun tool to work with. So if you haven't familiar with Notion, and if the ideas in LeSS books like use spreadsheet for backlog management sound too extreme, some more expanded version of a spreadsheet like Notion would actually be a very nice idea to try for your backlogs. Okay, so we have this statement in a LeSS adoption rules: educate everybody and use volunteers, right? It's very easy to do it in a less huge adoption. right? So I'm gonna make a funny statement that LeSS adoptions are actually super easy. You just say, hey, we're building this new organization over there. Who would like to join? Please join me. And some people join, and these are the best people you can have, and that's why it's so successful. I know it's not that easy, right, Konstantin? But I'm just making my point. If you're doing like a small LeSS adoption, you don't have this opportunity to say, hey, please join me. You essentially need everybody to be onboarded. So I had to, it was a 50 developers company, so I had to look literally into a pair of eyes of every developer before we did any change. Because if somebody says, so I don't agree, it's becomes really challenging. So educating everybody became this thing from the day one. Essentially how this all started, the VP of engineering brought the CEO and CTO to my Certified LeSS Basics online class. And they actually like the idea of LeSS and adaptivity because they've been working with 12 component teams and they can never get things done and they were not adaptive. You all know this story. And then they actually had a call with me next day after the class and say, yes, we love this idea. We would like to do LeSS in a company because of that and that. I'm like, yeah, so I'm ready like next Monday. Let's start. And they're like, no. Before we do anything, we want you to train everybody in the company. And to me, this was a sign, actually, they will succeed. Like they really took 3 months to make sure slowly everybody is mentally prepared for the change, really understood the change. So if you have a client who really wants to go LeSS and they are really trying to make the flip done next Friday, maybe it's a sign it will actually not succeed. Okay, and I had these clients after that who really wanted to do it next week, and actually it didn't work like that because, yeah, somebody wants, but you come and people have completely different ideas and understanding. It's an obvious statement. That's why we have educate everybody as a first LeSS adoption rule. Konstantin? Step 0. It actually was step 0 some years ago, and now it's a step 1. Maybe it's HTML formatting issue where you don't have a bullet. It's now on my computer. It's actually step number 1, and I remember it was step number 0, and I really actually like it like this. Yeah, so it actually way harder when you need to convince everybody. So essentially, we educated everybody, and I was running this in cohorts of people. Essentially, I broke my class into 3 modules, and every week. 3 groups of 3 mixed groups of developers who would come to the class. I would educate them on some particular aspect of the org design, backlog, team structure, etc. And then the end of the week, we will gather everybody, and there will be like an open space, a debate, and they will ask different questions, and they will challenge the whole thing. Well, the CEO got what he wanted. He got educated people. And that was actually very challenging also for him because, yes, people now understand and they can challenge you being informed. So a quick picture how the company looked like before. I'm using our ideas from org topologies where we classify teams by how low or high are they in terms of adaptability. But what you need to take from this picture is that there were 6 and 3, 9 teams together in the company, which were either component teams or very narrowly specializing team building some kind of a special function for the user. So there was a team who was specializing in printing checks on different printers. There would be a team for that. There will be another team specializing in how a menu is displayed in a restaurant, stuff like that. And this is where I started with this 9 basically component teams, 1 very small infrastructure team doing some cloud management, and basically 1 designer who was a bottleneck and all that. And then one of these Fridays where we got together after a certain module of education, and it's a redrawn picture, but basically it was what the CEO and his leadership team try to sell as an org design. They say, okay, we are going to have feature teams, cross-component, cross-functional, and everybody was actually happy with that. The first time developers said, we're gonna have feature teams, they said, yes, finally we can work on something that is really important for the business. It was so, heartwarming for me to hear developers wanting to go from this narrow specialization. So there was no question about feature teams, not feature teams. Yes, feature teams, but around what? And the idea of the CEO was like, okay, we're gonna have 4 teams working on this core product, the existing product, which is like B2B. But then he said, you know what? I always had this idea that we need to explore B2B2C market because we also want to have some UI for actual restaurant guests. So they can rank restaurants, look for restaurants. And so far, he said, we have been only focusing on B2B. And I never had any time, any capability to make you guys actually experiment with that new product, he called it. So how about now I will have a team, and this team will be dedicated to work on this B2C or B2B2C market. Everybody's like, maybe. And then he also said, but I also have an expert, my friend, and he's a growth expert, right? So, and we also were very sucky, he says, in how we actually grow the product and how we actually let people, tell more about the product so the product starts to promote itself. So how about we create a team just to focus on the growth topic. So this is essentially their initial org design. 4 teams in one area, kind of, and then 2 one-team areas, which is, we know from LeSS, a very small requirement area, it's not recommended. And then I'm like, yeah, but maybe you can actually work together. But what that happened is that because everybody was educated and everybody got this idea, actually we can work together, the developers started to question this constellation. And developers, I remember in this call, developers said, you know what? You said in the beginning of this whole thing, you want us to learn to work together as one team, right? Like a team of teams. And now you again putting these walls in between us. We don't want that, said developers. What we want is this. You just put all us in one kind of a team of team constellation, give us one backlog, and essentially if you want some B2C, B2B to C2B, whatever you want features, just put them on the top of the backlog. You know, it's super obvious, but it was powerful that the developers offered that suggestion to the CEO. And he like, but how about, and actually they realized this gives you maximum flexibility because now, well, if growth become a very important equal topic, you can just put more items on top of your backlog and maybe not just one, but all 6 teams can focus on that area. So was it change? In his mindset, it took us about 3 months with education and discussion to arrive to this org design. And this org design is actually what we have implemented in the company from day one of LeSS adoption. 6 teams working together, and these EMs, these are engineering managers. If I have more time, I will tell you a bit more about engineering managers. But essentially, they picked best team leads, and there were 3 good team leads with still very hands-on coding skills, and they've extracted team leads to engineering managers. So I'm kind of in a pattern collection mindset. So I call this pattern extract team leads. So if you extract a team lead and make him an engineer manager whose goal is not to micromanage the developers, but rather to, grow a discipline and make sure teams are better and growing, this is more aligned with I think optimizing goal. You can also question this org design and say why actually we also need line managers at all. But sometimes you need to pick the fights, and you need to agree with something everybody agrees. And the agreement in the company was, yes, we need aligned managers, but we don't need team leads anymore because we want all the team members to feel equal. So let's create this ecosystem with 1 product owner and 3 EMs. You have a question? Yeah. In this case, it was 2 teams per engineering manager, around I think 10, 12 people. But essentially what the engineering managers were doing all the time, they were actually in the teams just coding with the developers 80% of the time. And 20% of the time, they were actually essentially being Scrum Masters. No, it's such a small company. These EMs were in charge of hiring. That's why actually you need somebody who will abstract the teams from all this hiring bureaucracy. Yeah, question is if there would have been an HR department had this role been changed. Probably yes. So it's a kind of EMs. In this case, in this case, these are the best developers, also with kind of good communication skills. So they were doing all the engineering coaching and AI. Yes. Hmm. Yes. I'm gonna talk about it. Yes. Yes. The question was what happened, how many initial product owners were, and what happened to them. Very good question. I'm going to go into this question because what I'd like to show you is our flip event before I go any more into this bigger question. So it was in the middle of COVID, but we're able to get everybody together in one room for 2 days, which you might think is not enough to do everything. So essentially, what we did a lot of things. Like they really understand the backlog. We did the initial backlog refinement. We defined definition of done. I have a few more slides on that, and then we let people form the teams. In the spirit of self-team design workshop, where everybody actually had a sheet of paper with their skills, primary, secondary, etc. And then we had some kind of a template idea what the team would look like, and then the teams got formed in 2 rounds of 20 minutes. Interestingly, so this is how it was, just people walking and trying to figure out which team they're gonna have. We printed this big paper with all the components, so somebody starting components and just people trying to understand which skills they can apply elsewhere. There were a lot of girls coding in this company, which was fantastic to see. And this guy is representing a girl who got COVID positive the day before. So this is a VP of engineering representing this girl who has this development skill. It's an avatar, yeah. And then there was this rounds where actually everybody, so the managers who were not in the room, well, the teams were forming, and then after 20 minutes, I would invite everybody, the ex-product owners, the product managers, the CEO, etc., and everybody could just pick a microphone and share feedback and observation. And there was this moment where essentially VP of engineering, this guy puts me aside into the balcony, like, Alex, I need to talk to you. I'm like, okay, let's talk. And he's like, you know what? I see this team is forming, and this team, like all these people in this team, they have a habit of not getting things done. They're always not finishing what they tell they will finish. And now he says, all of them are in one team. He says, I wonder how we can disassemble this team before this disaster spreads in the company. And I'm like, oh, what do I do with that? And then I kind of said, okay, let's just follow the process. Okay, the process is like this: they form any teams that they want, and then you have a chance to share your feedback. And let's see if it takes us anywhere. And then essentially, this is the moment where he's sharing feedback. And he's such a nice guy. He sat on his knees, not to be like a manager who tells. He said, like, guys, you have this. And the answer from the team was, go away. We will be all right. Literally. And then we look at each other. I'm like, that's the process. I mean, they decide. And then essentially they agreed they would check on the team performance on sprint by sprint basis, whatever, and they never did. And when 4 months later, I was going through my photos and I found this photo. I'm like, oh, I now remember this. I scheduled a Zoom call with him because I was remote and everybody was then remote because of the COVID. I'm like, Ilya, do you remember? He like, I don't really remember much of it. I'm like, so essentially he never checked on them and was never an issue. Learning point, I don't know. I guess people will tend to overmanage and be over, trying to be too much into the details, and they believe they know things, although, well, you don't really know things, and you just need these new teams to form, share feedback, and maybe the fact that he shared the feedback raised some awareness in the team, and they paid. Essentially, this probably was the best team somehow in terms of performance. Also because it got a very senior developer. By the way, question: what happened to the product owners? I will answer it partially, but one of these guys on the picture, I'm not gonna point because it's on a record, etc. He used to be a product owner of one of the component teams. And if you have component team product owners, typically these are not like business-oriented product owners, not really product managers. It's just, a best developer who can, prioritize a list or do some business analysis. So out of those 6 or 7 previous product owners per team, this guy in this picture, he was the only guy who said, finally, I can go back coding. So one of the 5 or 6 product owners before Les joined the team as a developer. And because he was such a great developer, he had been promoted beforehand, but now because he can be full-time developer, that team was actually fantastic and he was teaching everybody whatever he knew. Right? So like 1 out of 5, 6, which like 15-20%. If that's also the case, you guys see. I was surprised, but he was really happy and he was amazing at doing that. And he didn't see it as a demotion. For him, this is what he always wanted to actually keep doing. And he saw being a product owner as a kind of impediment of some sort. So yeah. And then what we did in this workshop, we did a definition of done workshop where it was the first time I did it this way, but then I think Abbas, who read my case study, kind of liked that approach. That's why I'm sharing it here. So we collected on the wall like everything that is currently being in a definition of done for the majority of the teams. And because the teams are different, not every team has the same definition of done, but we were able to get some kind of average picture. And then we actually ask ourselves, what would be the long-term ideal state of a division of done? And we call it DoD 3.0. Like what would be like in a couple of years, what you as feature teams would like to do. And they put a lot of things like automation, like AI and everything there. And of course, the gap was super big from what the teams can do now and what the teams would like to be able to do later on in terms of definition of done. And then my coaching question was like, okay, what would be the things you can pull from that future to actually learn to do in the first LeSS sprint? So this is how it was before the LeSS flip. These 2 sets is what we want the feature teams to focus on in terms of definition of done. And it was, as you can see, a great improvement, although of course there were still a lot of things the teams were not able to actually even imagine doing in a sprint. But one very significant item that was pulled into the team was this, what they called client feature onboarding. So I'll just tell you a few words about that. So essentially in a pre-LeSS era of this company, how it worked, the team was building a feature and then they shipped it and they're done. Still, it doesn't mean somebody is using this feature. And because it's a B2B, it's also quite a complex product. Then there was a department which was called client onboarding, which essentially is a feature onboarding, who had to arrange a call with a restaurant and actually plan a visit to the restaurant and actually convince those restaurant people to actually use this feature for free. but because there was different hardware in place, it was not so easy and obvious to do. But essentially, those people would call the restaurant, promote this feature, show some video, explain how the feature worked, configure this feature for this client, and then now the feature is done, but works only for this client. And then with this feature toggling option, they would roll out this feature for many other clients. So the problem was that these onboarding people, they actually never kind of knew which features already in a release and which are not. So there was a problem of kind of release notes communication, which is not a very complex problem to solve. But another problem was that developers actually never knew which features are actually already being used by clients and which not. And of course, this created like a queue between developers and onboarding department, and the feedback was very much delayed. Also, a very obvious topic for you guys, but this was this situation. And I was really positively surprised when they had this discussion, and I invited those onboarding people to the Flip event. That's where they had the discussion with a developer, and they really tried to understand how to bridge this gap. Question mark, yeah, what should be in your definition of done? That feature works for all clients? Well, that might take you still much more than a sprint, right? A feature works on just one client. So essentially what they did, they agreed that the feature is done when it's live for a single client. Yeah, and which was a good agreement, because now at a PBR events and when they were analyzing and planning this feature, somebody would ask, so then for which of these clients we're actually building that? You know, like, oh, we actually don't have a client with, and then it triggers some thinking and discussion, and then you would invite client onboarding people to your PBR meetings, and then they start discussing, so actually which clients out of these metrics, and there was like huge metrics, clients and different hardware options. So which of these clients can actually use this feature already with existing hardware, or they need to upgrade the printer, etc., etc. And essentially, the team was using these onboarding people to actually make contact with the client and make sure that by the end of a sprint, or in the middle of a sprint, this feature goes to production to that particular client. It was a huge improvement, I think. That's maybe the major big topic. I'm really happy with this LeSS adoption. And then recently, I found this book called Zero Distance. It's actually bringing, you know, developers to the Gamba, as we say in the LeSS community, but essentially minimizing the distance between the developers and the customers to zero, and this is what was happening. Of course, it was not too fluid. In the first sprint, the team was actually trying to call the customer, and it never worked because the customer was not in place. So essentially, the team changed the model, and they were using the client onboarding as a service. Make an appointment with the customer, and then we're going to talk with the customer. So the client onboarding department, which was like a few people, it still remained. But the function changed from being a bottleneck to being kind of enabler and facilitator, which was interesting. So I'm checking what else I need to, I have time to cover. Yeah, and then the last but big part of the Flip event was the initial PBR. And if you read through LeSS books, I think they recommend the initial PBR is what, couple of days, Gene? 2 or 3 days is the recommendation. We had only 2 days between the lockdown to squeeze this event, so we didn't have that much time. And essentially, in my case study, I have lessons learned analysis where I say, well, this was too little time. So if you guys planning any kind of Flip events, don't try to make them fit in 1 or 2 days. It's just impossible. Your first sprint will suffer badly, and then people will say, oh, your last thing is so chaotic, it doesn't work. You really need to follow the guides of having 2 and 3 days. For the PBRs, we didn't have that, so we had like a half a day for that. And what I realized that actually before people can actually start discussing new requirements, they actually need to understand the current system. And because everybody works so narrowly, individualistically on printers or on very narrow things, together they all knew the product, but there was like nobody who would really understand the customer journey. So essentially, even half of that initial PBR was spent on some people actually teaching and showing interfaces and actually explaining how the product works. Although most of the people had been with the company for like years. And that became actually the pattern for our regular PBR events, where like we start to PBR an item with somebody showing how this currently works. Essentially, again, an obvious topic, but don't underestimate how little people understand about the product, even if they work on it for many, many years. Because we had to do everything after this flip remotely, we used Miro, and what we actually did, we had this huge Miro board, one Miro board for the entire company, for all the teams, and we would do all the PBRs, we'll do all the sprint plannings, we would do retrospectives, like everything was on the huge Miro. Miro doesn't really like these huge boards. If you ever try it, it becomes a little but it became obvious a year after. But first months and first half a year, Miro was quite okay with this many boards in place. So I'm gonna focus just on the PBR part of the board, just to give you some ideas so how it looked like. So the block number one is, so I taught them how you split items, because essentially, as you know, like team members, developers don't know how to split big items. So I did a workshop on splitting, and these were like the key slides of that workshop, so people actually remember how to do splitting. Then box two was the DoD, right? DoD 2.0. Like, what is that we believe we must do within a sprint to call something done? Box number three was the backlog. We use Notion for backlog management, but then essentially before this meeting, somebody would come and create posters in a Miro for the top of the backlog, like 10 items. And so number four, interestingly, the product was, because it was complex and everybody just knew little components and things like this, there were some quality issues. And again, I'm not going to go in details why, but I have a big chapter in my case study on analysis of root causes of those issues. But essentially, out of 6 teams, there were sprints where 3 teams had to be on support. There were so many incidents happening that sometimes actually less adoption was only with the 3 teams were in a sprint, and other 3 teams were just, firefighting. They later on changed how they actually classify things, and incident and non-incident. They realized they cannot fix all the issues, and somehow also quality got improved. And over the time, it was enough just to have 1 team being on support. So when I was leaving the company half a year later, it was enough to have just only 1 team on support out of 6. Was a big improvement. But in the early 5-6 sprints, we had this Excel sheet where you would mark which sprint, which teams were on support, to make it a fair rotation. And somebody would say, we actually would like to continue being on support. So don't, again, overmanage that. Give people a chance to say whatever they want, but essentially, in the long run, you want all the teams to spend equal time on the support duty. And then we would create these rooms in Zoom. We use breakout feature in Zoom, and then visually we had a map in Miro where we actually would pull some items from the backlog into these rooms. We would ask which experts do we need in this room, somebody from onboarding, somebody from product management, and then we would mix teams, and then they would spend time refining. And then on the number 7, this part of the board, I guess you understand this. This is like story points estimating. So every time team breaks out an item or creates a new item, they can triangulate this item, comparing it to the existing items, and they would put it somewhere. And now all the teams actually share the same story points. And our agreement was like 13, 20, and above is just way too much. You need to split it. But something before 8 story points, it's something that the teams can do a bunch of this in a sprint. So the teams would typically can do 5 items of 3 story points per sprint, maybe a couple of items of 5 story points a sprint, and maybe 1 item of 8 story points a sprint. And then essentially, over time, it was interesting that you see typically this graph. You typically have like a normal or super normal distribution, right? Where a lot of items are in the middle. So a lot of items, the majority of items had 3 to 5 story points. This is a sign you probably can stop estimating, because essentially you can just go to no estimates. And one big learning, and this is probably the last topic I have time to cover today. The change in LeSS, where this was an old picture, nice and fancy. I like this picture. I taught a lot of classes on this picture. Now, if you go to LeSS website and look for PBR, you have only that picture. I was like, are they missing something there? It's like just one box, but essentially the new LeSS rules or guidelines is that you don't do this overall backlog refinement. And we actually did it because also it was on a LeSS website. It's also the way we thought. So before we invited the teams to work on this board, we essentially spent about an hour with the product owner and product managers to actually discuss which team in this backlog refinement will be refining which item, how many teams will be on support, which expert do we need. It took about an hour of this extra overhead. And essentially, over half a year of us trying to improve our PBRs, we realized actually this is not needed. What you need is this. Just create mixed groups and just let the mixed groups refine the top of the backlog. Easy as that. And if somebody is going to be on support next sprint, well, it's okay, but they learn something. So essentially, I think this is a very beautiful picture which just says that you don't need to over prepare. And it took us about half a year to arrive to that conclusion. Now the last point, because I still have 2 minutes, and there was a question: what happened to the product owners of the teams, right? Essentially, think there are 2 ways for a team level product owner. Either you get promoted to a team member developer, and 1 guy out of 6, I remember one, or you become something else. And I had a long discussion with the CEO. So how do you want it to be? And I said, probably you're going to have too many of these people if they're not in the teams. But his arguments was, well, if I call them team members, they will quit my company and I will lose these skills, and they don't want to be called anything but product managers. So essentially, it was something the company was ready to implement. They introduced this role, and I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's just they introduced this role of a product manager. So essentially, there was this 3 to 4 guys now being called product manager and kind of forming a group of product managers trying to help the product owner and the teams to do whatever necessary to do. Positive and negative sides of this decision. Positively, well, as the teams also learn and expand beyond the understanding, because now they're in the feature teams, the same happened to the product managers. Before you were a product owner of this component team, now you're just a product manager. So you kind of disassemble, detach the people from work, and now I saw all these product managers were actually learning different items on the backlogs and trying to actually also expand their understanding of the product and be helpful when they can be helpful. The downside is that you typically have more of these people than you probably need, and then they start doing something together, right? They will try to be useful. And these guys were really trying to be useful, and they were trying to come up with a discovery process. Define as pictures how Spotify does the discovery, and for about 4 months, they were brainstorming, and I was just looking at that, waiting for this to fail, because I know this failed, but I was just waiting, and they were trying to create document how you do discovery and how the product manager is essentially, it all came to nothing, and they realized, well, probably we just need to try to be useful in this new ecosystem. And essentially, they just became product managers who have domain skills. Most of them actually had worked in restaurants themselves, so they were these domain experts. And every time on a PBR, they would join some teams in a room, and they would try to explain some business rules or try to apply the business analysis skills. And this essentially, they were like a free-floating elements in a system, not being attached to the teams. And one last comment I make on this topic, because I think it's a big topic, actually deserves a special talk on that. What happens to the product owners? They really ask the teams to open up Slack channels and be invited to the daily scrums and also to do Scrum of Scrums. And the teams said, no. We don't want you to be any close to us in a sprint. We are a self-managing group. Just leave us alone. So these guys really had hard times to finding a new place in a company. Well, essentially, they found a place in a company. But they had really hard times because the team pushed them away. The team said, we had enough of you before. We're now a self-managing team. This is how Alexey said we are. Just, we don't need you. Those guys were really, yeah, I know we are out of time.